She was born in a land of ancient stone and whispering monks, where the river coursed like time itself and the scent of incense lingered in the air like memory. The city was Lavo, an aging jewel once belonging to the Khmer, now teetering between fading glory and Thai ambition. It was here, amidst the golden walls and fading murals. It was a place steeped in layers of belief, Hindu rites fading into Buddhist quietude, Khmer temples shadowing newer Thai stupas. Merchants came and went from faraway lands. Monks passed through with manuscripts tucked under their robes, and governors served both old loyalties and new realities. In this twilight realm, Suda came into the world. Not as a princess. He had once sworn allegiance to the Khmer Empire, but in recent years, he had begun quietly sending gifts northward, to the court of sea Inthrathit in Sukhothai. He saw which way the winds were blowing. And more importantly, he saw in his daughter something that defied tradition. From a young age, Suda displayed a hunger for learning that startled even the monks. Where other girls were taught the motions of the loom and the chants of household ritual, she asked questions that disturbed the silence. Why did the monks write only in Pali and Khmer? Why did the women pray behind veils while the men debated in the open? Why were the most sacred stories locked in scrolls only few could read? Her father, torn between duty and affection, broke the rules. He brought her scrolls of Buddhist texts, allowed her to sit near the scriptorium as the scribes worked, and even let her listen to the debates among scholars from neighboring kingdoms. She was given a tutor, an old monk who had once copied royal edicts in Angkor, now half-blind and half-lonely. He taught her not only script, but the meaning hidden in its curves. By the time she reached womanhood, Suda could read and write fluently in Khmer and Pali, and speak Thai with the elegance of a courtier. She could identify kingdoms by their seals, map trade routes from memory, and recite the Vinaya like a monk. But she did not boast. She watched, learned, remembered. Her gift was not brilliance for its own sake but clarity, a stillness that turned chaos into understanding. It was during a feast honoring a visiting envoy from Sukhothai that destiny shifted. The envoy was not Ram Khamhaeng himself, but his elder brother Ban Muing, sent to survey Lavo's readiness for alignment. With him came rumors of Sukhothai's growing strength, its benevolent king sea Inthrathit, and his bold son, Ram, who had driven back Khmer forces and built canals for farmers. Among the nobles of Lavo, opinions were divided. Some feared Sukhothai's rise. Others saw opportunity. Suda's father saw something more enduring than politics. He saw alliance. A marriage was proposed between his daughter and the young prince Ram Khamhaeng. It was bold. Ram was not heir apparent. His brother Ban Muing stood first in line. But there were whispers that Ram had more fire, more vision. The offer was sent in secret, with gifts, palm leaf manuscripts, lacquered boxes, a statue of Avalokiteshvara. Months passed. Then came the reply. Ram accepted, or rather, his father did. The union was to be symbolic, a gesture of goodwill between rising Sukhothai and the old guard of Lavo. But for Suda it would mean much more. It would mean leaving behind the only city she knew, the only libraries she had wandered, the only temples whose stones she had touched like prayer. She did not weep. She packed her scrolls, gave her tutor a last blessing, and knelt before her father with composure. She had studied enough to know that history was never written by those who stayed still. If the script of her life was to matter, it would have to move beyond Lavo. The journey northward was long and winding. The landscape changed, from the carved stone of Lavo to the soft hills and rice fields of Sukhothai. Along the way, she observed, farmers spoke a Thai more musical than hers. Children played with charms made of bronze. Monks chanted in both Pali and something else, a rustic dialect that had no formal script. She made notes. She asked questions of their guides. By the time they reached the capital, Suda had already begun mapping not only the land but the language of the people. Sukhothai was young, vigorous, and unburdened by the weight of ancient empire. Its temples were simpler, its palaces more open, its streets filled with laughter and purpose. Where Lavo had carried the heaviness of memory, Sukhothai pulsed with anticipation. At the center of it stood Ram Khamhaeng, not yet king, but already legendary. He greeted her not with ceremony, but with a challenge. According to one account, he handed her a tablet and asked if she could read a Khmer verse carved into it. She read it aloud and then offered a correction in syntax. He laughed, not mockery but admiration. From that moment, an unspoken partnership began. They were different. Ram was fire, action, charisma. He hunted elephants, led campaigns, ate with soldiers. Suda was water, reflection, restraint. She observed, analyzed, recorded. But in their difference there was harmony. Where he ruled by vision, she governed by insight. Where he raised cities, she asked what they should teach. And slowly, her influence began to shape the very fabric of Sukhothai. In the early years of their union, she was not seen as a queen. She attended no councils, led no rituals. But she was always present, just beyond the curtain, just outside the frame. Scribes began to seek her opinion. Monks asked her to read. Even traders noticed that their goods were more likely to be approved if they first passed through the silent chamber, as her study came to be called. It was in that chamber that she began compiling texts, not merely copying but curating. She envisioned a script that could capture the tones of Thai, the clarity of Pali, and the aesthetics of Khmer, without being beholden to any. It was a dream she did not speak aloud, not yet. But she began planting the seeds, in conversations, in shared scrolls, in her husband's ear late at night. Ram, for his part, began to change. He still fought, still led, but his speeches took on new rhythm. His edicts grew more precise. He began asking scribes to transliterate Pali chants into Thai sound patterns. When he visited temples, he paid more attention to their murals and inscriptions. The people thought him inspired. In truth, he was listening. Years later, when the Thai script would be unveiled, it would bear his name, Ram Khamhaeng, father of the written Thai language. And it would be deserved. But those who knew that the idea was older than the ink. It had begun in a chamber in Sukhothai, with a woman from Levo who had once asked why stories must be locked in a language not her own. But all that was yet to come. For now, she was just Suda of Sukhothai, the noble wife, the quiet scholar, the child of Levo who had traded memory for possibility. And in that trade, a kingdom would find its voice. Suda learned early that visibility was not the path to power in Sukhothai. Her name was not etched into temple foundations, her face not painted on palace walls. But she understood something deeper, that the movements shaping a kingdom often occurred in the quiet corners, behind silken curtains and within folded scrolls. If Ram Khamhaeng was destined to shape the future with a sword and a vision, she would guide his hand with silence and certainty. Sukhothai was no longer a struggling outpost but a thriving seat of ambition. Under sea Inthrathit, the foundations had been laid. Irrigation canals had brought rice to every bowl, temples had risen from clay, and roads had begun to stretch outward like veins feeding a young, pulsing heart. But it was Ram, the second son, who began to show the kind of restless energy that made nobles shift in their seats and neighbors reevaluate their borders. Suda watched him grow into this role with a mix of admiration and concern. He moved through the court like a monsoon wind, swift, disruptive, necessary. Soldiers followed him not for loyalty, but because they believed he was the storm that would clear the old air. And yet, with every campaign, every negotiation, every speech that stirred the hearts of farmers and monks alike, she saw what others missed. The growing weight behind his eyes, the cracks forming beneath the confidence. She did not confront him. She made herself present without intrusion. In the evenings, she read aloud passages from Buddhist texts, not as instruction, but as balm. She sent messages to distant governors not under his name, but hers, gentle inquiries, small gifts, careful reminders that harmony need not come through conquest alone. She compiled ledgers of rainfall patterns and harvest yields, whispering into his plans the right time to move armies and when to stay still. While the palace buzzed with ambition, Suda took residence not in the halls of decision, but in the temple libraries, in the quiet of the scriptorium. She befriended scribes who had once worked for Khmer masters, coaxing from them insights about how empires documented their glory and hid their flaws. She questioned the monks on the limitations of language in conveying truth, planting seeds of curiosity that would later blossom into a national script. In her presence, even the most stoic of scholars found themselves reevaluating what knowledge meant when it remained locked behind old symbols. Ram Khamhaeng began to notice something shifting in his court. Advisors who once bickered over protocol now referenced Suda's notes. Temple renovations included schools for young girls, a concept quietly championed by her conversations with the head abbots. Visiting dignitaries were increasingly gifted local manuscripts, some of which Suda had translated herself. No decree announced her influence, no seal bore her name, but the kingdom was changing in ways only those closest to the center could feel. As Ram's reputation expanded beyond Sukhothai, foreign kingdoms began to take notice. Envoys from Lan Na, Lavo, and even the Khmer heartlands arrived with questions cloaked in pleasantries. Ram hosted them with flair, offering feasts, dances, and political games. Suda, meanwhile, created the real archive. She kept a record of each gift, each phrase spoken in negotiation, each shift in tone. What others dismissed as passive observation, she wielded as a strategic weapon. It was during one of these diplomatic seasons that Suda quietly initiated a cultural inventory of the kingdom. She sent monks and scribes into villages to gather stories, songs, local idioms. She wanted to understand not just how the people lived, but how they thought. What metaphors did they use for justice? What colors did they assign to memory? The answers, when compiled, revealed a tapestry far richer than the court had imagined. Sukhothai was not one people but many, united not by decree, but by experience. This knowledge shaped policy. Festivals once limited to palace grounds now extended into village squares. Taxation schedules were adjusted to agricultural cycles rather than religious calendars. The royal court began to adopt local proverbs into official discourse, giving peasants the strange thrill of hearing their own words echoed from marble halls. As Ram Khamhaeng stood before the future, sword in hand and crown upon his brow, it was Suda who walked behind him, unseen but never absent. When generals boasted of conquest, she ensured that grain reached the villages newly annexed. When monks debated theology, she quietly introduced translated texts that bridged sectarian divides. When nobles whispered doubts about Ram's ambitions, she reminded them, through carefully curated audiences and timely gifts, that power could be gentle and still unshakable. One evening, as the monsoon clouds rolled in and drums echoed from the southern gates, Ram turned to her and asked, not as a ruler, but as a man, what she saw in the kingdom's future. She answered not with prophecy, but with a single sentence, "What we build in silence will last longer than our names." He did not reply. He simply nodded. And so, Suda continued her work. Not as queen, not as regent, not as legend, but as the silent observer who had come from Lavo to shape a golden kingdom not with force, but with vision. A kingdom that listened, a kingdom that learned, a kingdom that, unknowingly, began to speak in the words she had first imagined long ago. When the sun finally set on King C. Inthrathit's reign, the earth of Sukhothai felt different. It was not grief that filled the streets, but a solemn breath held in the hearts of thousands, alive with change and voices not yet given name. While Ban Muing ruled with the calm of a scribe finishing a familiar manuscript, the people began to whisper the name of another, Ram Khamhaeng. He had become a legend even before his father's ashes cooled. Tales of his bravery against the Khmer, of his irrigation works that had fed starving villages, of his bold tongue that silenced foreign envoys. These were the songs sung in village markets and temple courtyards. But legends are rarely polite about succession. They threaten the stillness of tradition, and Suda understood that better than anyone. In those uncertain years, Suda moved through the palace with the grace of someone who knew her role was not to be seen, but to guide. She never questioned the legitimacy of Ban Muing's reign, not publicly, not privately. Instead, she focused on fortifying Ram's image among the scholars, the monks, and the merchants. While her husband rode out to the provinces to quell unrest or mediate disputes, Suda curated narratives. She ensured that when scrolls were copied, Ram's victories were included. When sermons were given, his generosity was praised. She also saw what Ram could not, that his charisma, though powerful, needed restraint to become leadership. She reminded him, gently and consistently, that might does not become right until it is tempered by responsibility. She showed him letters from farmers asking for canal repairs, not new conquests. She placed before him reports of merchant caravans delayed by bandits, not foreign spies. She trained his focus not on war, but on rule. When Ban Muing fell ill, some said from exhaustion, others from poison whispered by jealous nobles, the court turned, reluctantly, to Ram. It was not a smooth transition. Old advisors hesitated. Governors questioned the legality of succession. And in that swirling uncertainty, it was Suda who acted. She called upon her contacts in Levo, in the monasteries, in the southern rice valleys. Letters were sent bearing no royal seal, but every word carried the weight of wisdom. A king is not chosen by birth, one message read, but by the fruit of his care. In less than a season, support for Ram had spread like fire through dry fields. The coronation was swift. There were no fireworks, no grand proclamations. Ram Khamhaeng ascended the throne as if he had always been there. And beside him, standing just behind the curtain, was Suda, the queen without a title, the architect without a monument. As king, Ram moved quickly. He reduced tariffs on interprovincial trade, built roads to remote villages, and restructured temple patronage to support both large monasteries and local shrines. He toured the kingdom not with soldiers, but with scholars and engineers. A child born in the East might never understand a tax edict written in the West. It was more than inconvenient. It was dangerous. A kingdom without a common language could fracture. A culture without its own script could forget itself. Suda returned to Sukhothai with a renewed sense of purpose. In the sanctum of her study, she laid out scripts from Khmer, Pali, and ancient Mon. She noted their strengths and flaws. She began sketching symbols, pairing sound with form. She was not designing a script yet, not formally, but she was preparing the soil. Meanwhile, Ram, now confident on the throne, found himself increasingly reliant on her insights. Not just in matters of culture but in politics. When the northern lords grumbled about tax reforms, it was Suda who suggested opening trade festivals in their cities to compensate for lost prestige. When a Buddhist sect began challenging the court's orthodoxy, it was Suda who proposed inviting them to Sukhothai not for debate but for dialogue. She did not attend court sessions, but her presence hovered just beyond the torches and the scrolls. Her name was spoken only in whispers, yet when decisions were praised, it was often her reasoning behind them. As years passed, Sukhothai blossomed. Monks traveled hundreds of miles to debate scripture in Sukhothai's temples. And Ram, the once impetuous prince, now ruled with a balance of force and grace that few could match. But Suda saw deeper than triumph. She saw the cracks that could grow beneath unchecked expansion. She began gathering stories of injustice, of regions feeling neglected, as the stars reflected in the palace pools and the sound of distant flutes carried through the air. Suda sat alone with her scrolls. She was drawing symbols again, pairing sounds she had heard on their travels with shapes that could survive time. She was not claiming authorship. She did not care for that. She only wanted her people to have words that belonged to them. Ram joined her in silence. He looked over her shoulder and saw what she was doing. He did not speak. He did not need to. He picked up a reed pen and drew beside her. In that moment, a king was not born by bloodline or crown. He was made by understanding, by humility, by partnership. And beside him, the kingdom was expanding, not only in borders but in soul. Sukhothai was no longer just a city of farmers and monks, but a capital teeming with scribes, merchants, pilgrims, and emissaries. With every passing season, Ram Khamhaeng's vision of a benevolent and united land was becoming reality. Roads had been carved through jungle and mountain. Temples rose like islands of light across rice plains. Markets brimmed with voices speaking in dialects that twisted the Thai tongue into strange rhythms. Suda heard something others did not, a fracture forming in the silence between words. The people were loyal. They paid tribute not because they were forced, but could not write their names. Edicts sent from the palace were read aloud by temple scribes in Pali or Khmer, languages that belonged to gods and conquerors, not to the people themselves. She was not alone. Over the years, she had cultivated a circle of scribes, monks, and poets who shared her vision. They called themselves nothing, held no formal meetings, and never acknowledged Suda as their leader. But she was the sun around which they orbited. Each brought fragments. A merchant's chant from the south, a hunter's rhyme from the north, a lullaby remembered by a grandmother from the river villages. Suda recorded them all, marking tones, sounds, pauses. It was not enough to capture meaning. She needed to capture music. The Chinese emperor ruled over dozens of ethnicities, yet the brushstrokes of Mandarin bound them. Ram saw this as a model, but Suda cautioned him. Chinese script carried the weight of bureaucracy and privilege. What they needed was a language of the people. In the year 1282, Suda presented her first set of symbols to Ram. They were drawn not with the formal flourishes of Khmer or Pali, but with deliberate simplicity. Each character represented a sound, a breath, a beat of the human voice. She explained her system. Tones, so vital to Thai expression, had been encoded in diacritical marks that danced like birds above the line. Ram was silent for a long time. Then he asked her one question. Would the farmers understand this? She replied, "They will feel like they've come home." In the months that followed, the palace became a workshop of language. Scribes practiced carving the new characters into palm leaves, testing how ink bled along different lines. Monks debated the placement of tone marks. Children were invited into temple schools and asked to copy their own names using the new script. The results were clumsy at first, but slowly a rhythm emerged. Pattern. A pulse. Ram Khamhaeng knew this was more than a writing system. It was a declaration that Sukhothai would not be a shadow of Angkor, nor a tributary of China, but a voice of its own. And so, in 1283, he commissioned the creation of what would become the most enduring artifact of his reign, the Ram Khamhaeng stele. Carved into stone with precision and poetry, the stele bore not only the script but a manifesto. It spoke of justice, of freedom, of prosperity. It described a king who ruled not with fear but with love, a people who could ride to his palace without being taxed, a kingdom where rice grew so freely that birds had no reason to steal it. It was both myth and message, and behind its measured lines lay the unseen hand of Suda. Her name appeared nowhere on the stele. She did not ask for it. Instead, she requested something else. The first schools using the new script be opened in temple courtyards, not royal halls. Let monks teach it beside sermons. Let children learn it alongside prayer. Let women, especially women, have the right to write. Ram agreed. In the years that followed, the script spread faster than roads. Merchants used it to tally their goods. Midwives recorded births, breaking barriers that had stood for generations. Her home became a sanctuary for those seeking to express what had once only lived in voice. But not everyone celebrated the change. Traditionalists whispered that the new script lacked sacredness, that Sukhothai was abandoning its place in the Khmer spiritual lineage, that writing should remain the domain of the elite. A poem by a widow who had taught herself to write. The critics fell silent. One day, while walking through a market near the city gates, Suda paused beside a pottery stall. A young boy was reading aloud from a palm leaf book, his voice strong and clear. The script was rough, his rhythm uncertain, but the words were his. And as he read, a small crowd gathered, not to listen to a monk or a scholar or a king, but to a child speaking the language of his land. Suda did not reveal herself. She simply stood there, watching the future take shape. Later that night, she returned to her study and recorded the moment in her journal. She ended the entry with one sentence: "What we give without name returns tenfold in legacy." The script of the nation was no longer an experiment. It was a heartbeat, and though the world would call it the Ram Khamhaeng script, was the quiet vision of a woman who gave her people the power to speak and to remember. The script had taken root. Like water threading through the soil after the first summer rain, it seeped into every corner of the kingdom. But scripts alone did not hold kingdoms together. Literacy did not fend off discontent. The beauty of symbols could not shield a monarch from the burden of power. Ram Khamhaeng had given his people words. Now he would need to give them justice, unity, and vision. And behind all of that, unseen, uncelebrated, burned the quiet flame of Suda. As Sukhothai entered the prime of its golden age, Ram's presence stretched across the land. He was a tireless king, riding out to distant provinces to oversee irrigation projects, adjudicating land disputes among nobles, hosting foreign dignitaries under the gold-leafed eaves of his palace. The people revered him not just as ruler, but as protector. Statues were carved, poems were penned. His name rang like temple bells at dawn. But the heart of the palace pulsed not in the throne room, but in the sanctum of Suda's quiet chambers. She had become something rare in the history of queens, neither ornament nor shadow, but essence. She spoke little in public, offered no decrees, and yet her presence shaped policy more than any minister. She had become the one to whom the wives of governors wrote, not to plead, but to ask. Ask for schools in their provinces. Ask for permission to teach girls. Ask for books, not just for the sons of monks, but for the daughters of midwives. Suda replied with dignity and precision. Her correspondence stretched farther than Ram's cavalry, into the mountains of Lan Na and the floodplains of Phitsanulok. She never signed as queen. She signed simply, of Sukhothai. And that was enough. Her vision for the kingdom was not merely cultural, it was human. She believed that a strong nation was not built upon temples and trade alone, but upon the emotional fabric that bound its people to one another. She encouraged the appointment of local elders into consultative positions at court. She initiated the creation of village chronicles, collected not by scholars, but by grandmothers and storykeepers. She paid stipends to elderly monks to record oral traditions before they vanished with memory. She was redefining the soul of Sukhothai from within. And when conflict came, as it always does when power blooms, it was she who lit the path to preservation. The nobles of the southern provinces, long used to autonomy under Khmer rule, began resisting Ram's centralization. They accused the court of favoring northern customs, of diluting the old religious rites with commoner speech. They rejected the new script in official documents. They refused to send their sons to temple schools unless taught in classical Pali. Ram, furious at the insult to his reign and his people's language, prepared to send troops. He saw rebellion where there was fear. He saw insult where there was uncertainty. Suda saw something else, a test of the kingdom's compassion. She requested an audience not with the nobles. She shared with them translations of Buddhist texts in the new script, line by line, comparing clarity and faithfulness. She brought no arguments, no punishments, only understanding. Then, she made a bold gesture. She opened her personal library to the southern monks and invited them to annotate the texts. She gave them ownership in the shaping of what they had feared would erase them. And in time, the rebellion softened. Not because of force, but because a woman had offered respect where the crown had offered decree. It was Suda, too. Workshops began suffering under quotas set by administrators with no knowledge of the labor involved. Craftsmen were exhausted, underpaid, and voiceless. Strikes were whispered. Temples began receiving fewer offerings. Festivals grew quiet. Suda commissioned a census, not of households or fields, but of hands. She recorded how many weavers lived in each village, how many hours it took to finish a stupa carving, how often bronze casters fell ill from smoke and soot. She calculated not just output but dignity. With her findings, Ram enacted reforms. Fairer taxes for artisans, feast days set by trade guilds, temple orders redirected to local workshops. In response, artisans began inscribing her symbol, a single curved flame, into the bottom of their work. The flame had no royal designation, but it was hers. The people knew. Suda's influence did not threaten Ram. On the contrary, he grew stronger beneath its glow. He spoke with more clarity, governed with more compassion. When Chinese envoys visited, bringing tales of their emperor's all-seeing court, Ram presented Sukhothai not as an empire, but as a community of shared hearts. He recited lines from local poems, quoted folktales recorded by village scribes, offered gifts made by the very hands Suda had protected. Foreign dignitaries left with more than silk. They left with the feeling that Sukhothai was not merely ruled, it was loved. But even within love, there were trials. Disease swept through the eastern provinces one year. Floods ravaged the canal networks that Ram himself had helped dig. Famine loomed. Grain stores dwindled. Panic brewed in the capital. Ram's ministers called for rationing, for export bans, for military enforcement. Suda called for listening. She dispatched monks to every district, not to preach, but to record. What foods had people turned to in desperation? What herbs had the old women gathered from the forests? What prayers were being said not in temples but in doorways? She compiled these into a survival manual, part scripture, part cookbook, part hope. It was distributed on palm leaves across the kingdom. The people responded not with fear, but with resilience. Suda designed the rituals. As years passed, Sukhothai glowed with a quiet brilliance. It did not possess the military might of Angkor, nor the bureaucratic rigor of China. She never claimed authorship of the reforms that bore her fingerprints. But the kingdom knew. The children who learned to write, the craftsmen who were paid with dignity, the monks who found relevance in the new script, they all knew. And when they whispered prayers for the king, rising in unison from temple, field, and market, would echo with the rhythm of a flame, set alight by a woman who never sought to rule, only to serve. Sukhothai was not a kingdom of marble palaces or gilded towers. Its true majesty stood in the hush of temple courtyards, in the chanting of monks before dawn, in the curve of a lotus carving hidden beneath eaves few ever noticed. The kingdom's soul was built not with conquest, but with conviction. And no figure, not even the king himself, understood that soul more intimately than Suda of Sukhothai. As the land flourished under Ram Khamhaeng's just and generous rule, Suda turned her gaze from politics to spirit. Not in retreat, but in purpose. She had spent years shaping policy, tending to artisans, soothing rebellions, and refining the very language of the people. But now she sensed a deeper need, a hunger not for governance, but for meaning. It began with silence. She would wake before the sun, stepping barefoot into the temple gardens within the palace grounds. There, in the cool breath of morning, she sat among the gravel and stone, listening not for answers, but for questions unspoken. Suda responded not with sermons, but with structure. She proposed that every temple become more than a sanctuary. It should be a school, a hospital, a library, a place where the sacred and the everyday met without division. Ram gave her full support. He funded the expansion of monastic dormitories and the construction of new halls for women's instruction. That libraries included not only Buddhist texts but village chronicles, folk medicine, and agricultural guides. She believed enlightenment could be found as easily in a farmer's field as in a sutra. People began to call her, quietly, the Empress of Temples. The title had no crown, no legal standing, but it passed from monk to villager to merchant like a blessing. In the highlands of the north, it was said that her name was written in rice ink upon the walls of forest shrines. In the southern deltas, children recited prayers composed in the new script, poems she had compiled, though never claimed. Suda never established her own order, never built a monument in her name. Instead, she traveled, disguised not out of fear, but humility. Then she recorded their answers, not as edicts, but as reflections. From these travels emerged the 9 wisdom tablets, a collection of teachings not attributed to any single monk, but composed from hundreds of voices across the kingdom. The tablets taught compassion over certainty, patience over pride, and action guided by contemplation. They became widely copied, second only to the Tripitaka. Some believed the voice within them was Suda's. Others said it was the voice of the people themselves, gathered and purified through her. Her influence spread beyond faith. When the royal court debated the allocation of temple lands, it was Suda who proposed limits to prevent accumulation of wealth beyond purpose. When noble families attempted to buy their sons' way into high-ranking monkhood, she arranged for abbots to choose candidates through community merit. She believed spiritual power should rise from virtue, not lineage. Her approach drew admiration and resentment. Some monks clung to old hierarchies. Some nobles whispered that she was undermining royal authority. But Ram Khamhaeng silenced such rumors with a simple truth. His kingdom was stronger because its people believed not just in his rule, but in the goodness it inspired. And Suda's vision inspired goodness. Under her guidance, temples became sanctuaries for widows and orphans. They offered refuge to the sick, taught letters to children, preserved oral histories in the new script. For the first time, women began to write their own prayers, their own stories. In one small village, a group of fisherwomen inscribed a hymn of gratitude to Suda upon a stone pillar, not in gold leaf, but with river clay. It read, "She gave us the words we prayed with, and the hands to pass them on." She had become more than queen. She had become a memory in the making. One rainy season, a foreign scholar arrived from the Mongol court, bearing gifts and curiosity. He toured the kingdom, marveling at the integration of literacy, governance, and spirituality. Upon his return to China, he wrote of a place where the temples speak as the king does, and the king listens as the temples pray. He did not name Suda, but the world began to notice a different kind of power radiating from Sukhothai, one not built on expansion but on integration. Despite her reverence, Suda never sought asceticism. She lived fully, celebrating festivals, tasting seasonal fruits, laughing with apprentices. She believed the sacred existed in joy as much as in stillness. When festivals were planned, she ensured that dances honored not just deities, but ancestors and harvests. When temple bells rang, they were timed to align with the rhythms of village life. She infused faith with life and life with meaning. Her final gift during this time was the construction of a central sanctuary known as the House of Breath. Built at the confluence of 2 rivers, it was neither palace nor monastery. It was open to all, noble or farmer, monk or merchant. Inside, scrolls from across the kingdom were kept, each shelf labeled in the new script. Murals depicted not gods, but ordinary people in acts of compassion, sharing rice, teaching children, planting trees. A small chamber held a fire that never went out, tended day and night by volunteers. It was said to symbolize the breath of the kingdom, fragile, luminous, eternal. Suda visited the House of Breath often, always entering alone. She would spend hours copying texts. The lamp does not need a name. And so she continued, an empress without a throne, a teacher without a title, a builder of temples whose greatest construction was the inner landscape of a nation. While Ram Khamhaeng negotiated trade with foreign courts and forged alliances with neighboring states, Suda was forging something rarer, a shared moral identity, rooted in kindness and wisdom. Together, they created a kingdom not just of prosperity, but of purpose. And while history would etch Ram's deeds into stone, it would carry Suda's legacy in the breath between words, in the stillness before prayer, in the silent understanding that the holiest acts often leave no trace at all, except in the hearts they awaken. Sukhothai had grown beyond what even its founders imagined. No longer merely a kingdom carved from the decline of Angkor, it had become a center of gravity for the entire region. A kingdom not just of rice fields and pagodas, but of learning, diplomacy, and radiant cultural exchange. The name of Ram Khamhaeng was spoken in markets from Burma to China, in monastic halls from Lanzang to Srivijaya. But behind the king's renown, there was a quiet force that shaped the currents beneath the surface, widening the horizon of what this kingdom could be. Suda, never seated upon a throne, now sat at the crossroads of civilizations. The script she had helped give shape to had already transformed the cultural identity of the people. It had united dialects, preserved poetry, and recorded laws. But Suda knew that a script was not a wall to protect a culture. It was a bridge to carry it outward. And in the twilight of Sukhothai's first golden generation, she turned her attention not inward, but beyond the borders. Foreign emissaries began arriving in greater number. Khmer priests with sacred relics, Chinese scholars with paper and ink, Malay traders bearing spices, and Buddhist pilgrims returning from India. Suda greeted each not with regal detachment, but with scholarly interest. She asked them what stories were being told beyond their rivers, what gods were honored with what songs, what laws governed the pulse of their cities. She made notes not of their gifts, but of their thoughts. Within the palace, she established the House of Languages, a quiet wing of the central library where translators worked tirelessly to record foreign texts into the Thai script. But it was not only texts she sought to preserve, it was voices. She sent young scribes to accompany envoys abroad, not as diplomats, but as listeners. She trained them to observe nuance, to record metaphors, to understand how a people revealed themselves through the shape of their myths. Ram Khamhaeng encouraged these efforts, though the world knew little of how deeply his queen's hand guided his most enlightened decisions. When he sent emissaries to the Yuan court in China, it was Suda who prepared the gifts. A selection of translated Thai folktales, samples of temple poetry, and maps that showed not boundaries, but linguistic and spiritual flow. The Chinese scholars were astonished. They expected gold and elephants. They received culture and curiosity. Suda had understood something few did, that true diplomacy is not barter but resonance. And through this resonance, Sukhothai began to be seen not merely as a power, but as a presence. But the widening horizon also brought threats. New alliances meant new rivalries. The kingdom's southern trade routes, once secured through regional tribute, began to attract attention from seafaring empires. Reports reached Suda's chamber of foreign fleets circling the Gulf of Siam, of pirates attacking river outposts, of merchant guilds in distant ports slandering Sukhothai's tariffs. Ram was tempted to respond with might. His generals prepared defenses. But Suda advised another path, to deepen trust before drawing swords. She began corresponding directly with heads of merchant guilds across the peninsula, bypassing courts and palaces. She sent scrolls of translated laws, showing how Sukhothai protected commerce. She included personal letters from Sukhothai traders whose families had prospered under the new policies. In a bold and quiet move, she extended an invitation to rival merchants. Come see the kingdom, not as a competitor, but as a collaborator. Many accepted, and what they found was not a land of domination, but of order and beauty. They walked temple gardens where monks copied foreign maps. They ate meals prepared by villagers who spoke their names in perfect pronunciation. They visited schools where children recited proverbs that echoed their own, translated through Suda's careful hand. Trade increased, suspicion waned, and Sukhothai's position in the world deepened, not through dominance, but through trust. At home, Suda continued to nurture the spirit of cultural exchange. She commissioned the Scroll of Nations, a living manuscript that catalogued every foreign language heard within the kingdom, every tale shared across borders, every shared ritual that had taken root in Sukhothai soil. It was a mirror and a tapestry, a record of a kingdom shaped by openness, not fear. She also introduced the Festival of Shared Waters, a new annual ritual that invited every foreign community within Sukhothai to pour water into the same basin, symbolizing the shared lifeblood of a diverse nation. Ram presided over the first one, flanked not only by monks and ministers, but by foreign merchants, translators, and visiting students. It was said that when the waters mixed, a breeze stirred from the mountains, as if the land itself had exhaled in approval. But even as Suda looked outward, she never lost sight of the interior. She continued to collect local folk tales, sending scribes to the most remote provinces. She worried that in the rush toward cosmopolitanism, the voices of villages might be drowned. She asked that no foreign tale be recorded unless matched with one from the provinces. She believed that cultural richness was not built by adoption alone, but by honoring roots while reaching outward. Her vision was not without resistance. Some within the court began to question her expanding influence. They claimed she was diluting the purity of Thai culture, giving too much space to foreign ideas, threatening the sanctity of Sukhothai's identity. But Ram stood firm. He declared that the strength of a tree lies not in denying the wind, but in deepening its roots. And Suda, ever faithful to her unseen role, responded not with defense but with demonstration. She organized a week-long symposium at the House of Breath, inviting local poets, foreign scribes, Buddhist monks, and Taoist scholars to sit together, not to debate, but to share. Meals were served communally. No rank was honored above another. Children read stories from both Thai villages and foreign kingdoms. For 7 days, the palace echoed not with politics, but with laughter, curiosity, and revelation. At the close of the gathering, Suda released a simple scroll. It bore no royal decree, no religious command. Only a single line in the Thai script. All waters flow into the same ocean when hearts do not fear the current. The scroll was copied hundreds of times. It appeared in temples, marketplaces, and village schools. In time, it became a proverb etched into memory. As the horizon of Sukhothai widened, so did the understanding of what it meant to be Thai, not a singular identity, but a woven one. And at the center of that weave was Suda, translating, listening, remembering. She would never sail across the seas. She would never rule a foreign province. But her fingerprints would cross borders inked into paper, spoken on lips, etched in stone. She had turned a kingdom outward without losing its soul. And while Ram Khamhaeng expanded the borders of the land, it was Suda who expanded the borders of its spirit. The sun does not fall from the sky all at once. It recedes slowly, casting a longer glow before its final descent. In Sukhothai, that golden light lasted longer than in most places, softened by the grace of a kingdom built not on fear, but on faith. Yet even the brightest flame eventually flickers, and even the clearest vision dims with time. For Suda of Sukhothai, the woman whose silent labor had helped raise a nation's soul, the waning began not with illness, but with awareness. She felt it first not in her body, but in the air. The palace had grown noisier. More envoys, more scrolls stamped with new seals, more young voices in high rooms, eager to prove their worth. The older scribes she once taught now deferred to bolder apprentices who had never known a time before the script. Noble families vied for prestige not through service, but through spectacle. The temple still sang, but Suda began to notice a change in their tone. Rituals once rooted in compassion now felt rehearsed. Blessings turned into performances for the court. Ram Khamhaeng remained steady. His name still inspired trust. His presence still calmed disputes. But the fire in him had begun to shift. No longer the builder of canals or the student of scripts, he had become a figure of expectation, pulled by diplomacy, bound by legacy. His travels grew longer, his moments of stillness fewer. Suda, once the unseen architect of harmony, now watched as the edges of that harmony began to fray. She had given so much of herself to the kingdom that few had noticed her absence from the public rhythm. Her daily walks to the House of Breath became less frequent, her letters more sparse. The young scribes she had once mentored now ran the House of Languages without her guidance. Some asked where she had gone. Others assumed she was merely tired. But a few, those who had known her quiet ways, understood the truth. She was preparing to leave. Not in death. Not yet. But in presence. In responsibility. Suda had never seen herself as irreplaceable. She believed the purpose of wisdom was not to be possessed, but to be passed on. And so, in the silent hours before dawn, she began the quiet work of retreat. She entrusted her journals to a circle of trusted scribes, women and men who had grown up under her tutelage. She asked them not to preserve her writings as relics, but to adapt them, annotate them, question them. A kingdom that remembers only what is written, she once said, forgets how to think. She also called for a meeting, not of nobles, but of the temple elders from across the provinces. In a gathering held not in the palace, but in the courtyard of the oldest Bodhi tree in the capital, she sat among them, cloaked not in silk, but in plain linen. She asked each elder to speak of what their people feared. They spoke of changing seasons, of declining rainfall, of food shortages in the outer regions. They spoke of new ideas entering from foreign ports, ideas of greed masked as progress, of control masked as faith. Suda did not offer solutions. She offered presence, and a promise that their voices would be recorded, that their truths, however humble, would become part of the national memory. It was her final public act. After that, Suda withdrew almost completely from court. She returned to the sanctuary by the Yam River, a quiet structure she had built years earlier as both monastery and archive. There, in the shadow of fruit trees and the sound of flowing water, she spent her days copying texts by hand. Not state documents, not chronicles, but stories, parables, fables told by villagers. A monk would arrive with a verse for her to read. A village girl would present her with a handmade talisman, a token of gratitude for learning to write. But mostly she sat alone, dressed in travel robes. No guards, no gifts, just silence. He found her in the garden, watching the wind pass through a bamboo thicket. They spoke little. There was no need. Their lives had long been a dialogue of understanding. As dusk fell, Ram took her hand, more frail now, yet still steady, and placed in it a small, wrapped scroll. Inside was a poem, for lines, written in his own hand, a promise that no edict, no monument, no foreign treaty would ever carry the weight of what she had given him. The stillness to rule and the silence to listen. They parted at twilight. It was the last time they would see one another. Back in the capital, Ram Khamhaeng resumed his rule, but those closest to him began to notice a change. His voice grew more contemplative, his decrees more poetic. He spent more time in the temples, less in the council chambers. When asked why he no longer traveled to the outer provinces, over taxation, over territory, the cohesion Suda had nurtured began to loosen, not through rebellion, but through forgetting. The younger scribes no longer read the 9 wisdom tablets. Temple festivals became political stages. The flame of Sukhothai's golden age began to flicker, not extinguished, but strained. Back at the sanctuary, Suda felt it. She knew that no kingdom lasts forever, but legacy, if tended with humility, could outlive kings and walls and even names. One morning, as the mist lifted from the river, a novice found her seated at her writing table, pen still in hand, a half-finished fable before her. She had passed in her sleep, as if her body had simply followed her spirit into stillness. And let silence speak when words are no longer enough. They buried her beneath a Bodhi tree, not in the royal crypts, but beside the children's library she had helped build. There was no statue, no temple, no grand procession. Only villagers, hundreds of them, gathered with candles and scrolls, reciting verses they had learned in classrooms she had made possible. The light of Suda did not vanish. It softened, spread, became part of the air. And as Sukhothai stood poised between greatness and decline, between memory and myth, so too was the passing of Suda of Sukhothai. Her departure did not shake the palace, nor did it halt the work of ministers or the chants in temples. The kingdom turned, as it always had, but something had shifted, a quiet equilibrium lost, a pulse gone silent beneath the rhythm of royal drums. Ram Khamhaeng felt it in his bones. He continued his reign as the world expected him to, hearing petitions, managing foreign envoys, inspecting canal systems, and signing decrees. But those closest to him, his scribes, his commanders, even his grandchildren, noticed the change. The spark that had once ignited every council chamber, every provincial journey, had begun to fade. The king who once rode for days to speak with villagers now lingered in the inner palace. The ruler who had once shaped a kingdom through vision now stared too long at maps, as if hoping the past might reappear upon the parchment. He wore no black, held no public ceremony for Suda. That had never been her way. But he ceased to wear red, her favorite color. He stopped composing poems for court festivals. And he no longer visited the sanctuary by the river. Instead, he began to write alone. Not proclamations or letters of state, but reflections. Line by line in the script they had shaped together. In these pages, he searched for meaning, sometimes pleading, how she could sit for hours without speaking and yet seem to be answering questions no one dared ask. Ram never spoke of her influence aloud. He never credited her in edicts or carved her name into temple walls. But in his journals, he admitted what history refused to say. That the crown upon his head had been balanced, always. The monks, once united by the new script and shared vision, now debated doctrine with increasing severity. Younger nobles dismissed the 9 wisdom tablets as sentimental. Foreign envoys returned with less reverence, sensing a shift in tone. The court, once anchored by the invisible gravity of Suda's presence, began to drift. Ram attempted to intervene. He summoned scholars to recompile the founding chronicles. He ordered new translations of Buddhist sutras. He sponsored provincial art festivals. But these efforts felt hollow, echoes of a harmony that no longer had a source. Worse still, the people began to forget. Not Suda, not entirely, but the ways she had kept the kingdom woven. The grain archives she had maintained fell into disuse. The temple libraries she had curated became cluttered with court propaganda. The House of Languages was absorbed into the bureaucracy. The script remained, but its soul faded into the background of everyday function. One morning, Ram stood on the steps of the Grand Assembly Hall and watched the children of the palace scribes play in the courtyard. They wrote names in the dust with sticks, but would they remember the silence that had made the voice sacred? It was then that he resolved to leave something behind. Not another law, not another canal. Something personal, something lasting. He commissioned the carving of a stone monument that would stand in the heart of Sukhothai. But it would not be a tribute to himself. It would be a record, not of conquest but of philosophy. He wrote it himself in the script he and Suda had nurtured. Line by line, he inscribed the ideals they had lived by: freedom of thought, kindness over fear, leadership as service. He described a king who ruled like a father, a people who lived without chains, a kingdom where rice was plentiful and the markets just. And though her name was never etched into the stone, celebrated as the oldest known writing in the Thai language, a cornerstone of national identity, historians would marvel at its prose, its moral clarity, its vision of governance. But few would see the shadow in its margins, the absence of the woman who had helped give it voice. As the years passed, Ram aged into stillness. He rarely left the palace grounds. His hair silvered, his eyes dimmed. Foreign dignitaries were greeted by his sons. Council meetings were led by his ministers. Yet each morning, without fail, he walked the same path to the House of Breath, the sanctuary Suda had built by the river. He never entered. He only stood outside. Some say he whispered her name. Others say he waited for a sign. But all agreed that the king who once ruled with thunder now ruled with memory. Then, one morning, he vanished. No body was found. No ceremony was held. Some said he wandered into the forest. Still others insisted he had climbed the hill of the first temple and turned into mist at dawn. Whatever the truth, the kingdom mourned. But the morning was quiet. The golden age was ending, and the generation that remembered its architects was already fading. Sukhothai would live on. Its temples would stand. Its script would endure. Its name would echo across centuries. But the flame that had warmed its heart, the partnership that had shaped its soul, would pass into the realm of shadows. And so it was that Ram Khamhaeng, the great king, became legend. But in the places where wisdom is still whispered, where children are still taught that writing is sacred, and kindness more powerful than law, there remains the trace of a woman who once taught a nation to listen. She was never called queen in life, but she was the crown that steadied the kingdom, and he, even as king, was never more than the bearer of her light. The golden age was no longer present, it had become memory. And in that memory, the clearest outlines belonged not to those with crowns, but to those who never sought them. Suda's name did not live in chronicles. No official portrait hung in the palace. The newer generation of courtiers spoke of reforms as if they had emerged from policy, not from principle. The festival of shared waters became a display of unity rather than a ritual of reflection. The House of Languages was repurposed into an archive of royal decrees. And yet, beneath the surface of the new era, her legacy moved like groundwater, unseen, unforgotten. In a small village west of the capital, a girl knelt beside her grandmother, tracing letters in the dirt. The script was crude, misshapen, but unmistakable. The child asked who had invented it. The grandmother paused and said, "The king gave it to us, but there was someone else, a woman who helped him see." In the north, a monk recited from the 9 wisdom tablets to a gathering of farmers. Though the text had fallen from royal curriculum, it lived in temple corners and village chants. One elder stood and asked if the author had ever been named. The monk only smiled. "If she had wanted her name remembered," he said, "she would have written it down." At the edge of the kingdom, in a forest monastery rarely visited by officials, a scribe discovered an old scroll tucked behind an altar. It was weathered, its palm leaves brittle, the ink faded. But as he read it, he felt a hush settle over his chest. It was a journal, thoughts written not as orders but as questions. Reflections on language, on justice, on fear, on grace. No author was named, but there was a single line, written in a hand steady and sure. "A kingdom does not live in stone or law, but in the questions its people are still allowed to ask." The scribe copied the scroll by hand, word for word. He passed it to a novice who brought it to another monastery. In time, fragments of Suda's reflections began appearing in sermons, then in songs. A line about kindness was woven into lullabies. A phrase on leadership was carved into temple pillars. A meditation on listening appeared in a merchant's handbook. Her name was never attached, but her voice returned, not as proclamation, as presence. Sukhothai too changed. It was eventually absorbed into larger kingdoms. Ayutthaya rose, then Thonburi, then Bangkok. Wars came, scripts evolved. Monarchs rewrote their own myths. Yet through each wave of history, the script she had helped build endured. The letters curved with time but never vanished. The way Thai people wrote their names, recorded their dreams, offered their prayers, still bore the shape of her invisible hand. Centuries later, when archaeologists uncovered the Ram Khamhaeng inscription, they marveled at its vision. They studied its characters, traced the history it told. It became a symbol of national pride, the cornerstone of identity. The king was celebrated as he should be. Scholars debate its authorship. Tourists admire its poetry. Children are taught its origin. Few ask who sat beside the king as he carved. Fewer still consider the silence between the lines. And yet, in every temple school where children learn to write their first words, in every whispered chant preserved in rural dialect, in every humble poem scratched onto banana leaves, her presence lingers not in credit but in care. She was the architect of questions, the steward of memory, the mother of unspoken courage. She gave a kingdom its breath and asked for nothing in return. She built a script and gave it to the people. She shaped a ruler and asked him to listen. She saw the horizon widen and reminded the land to deepen its roots. And in the end, she passed not into legend, but into legacy, the kind that does not shout,